Not every locomotive rolling off the assembly line was destined to turn heads for the right reasons. While America's railroad history is filled with beautiful streamliners and iconic designs, there's a darker side to this story. Trains so awkward, ungainly, or just plain weird-looking that even their own crews struggled to love them. From experimental behemoths to ill-conceived streamliners, buckle up as we count down the 10 ugliest American trains you probably haven't seen. 10. GE E60 Electric Locomotive. General Electric's E60 electric locomotive was Amtrak's bold attempt to replace the aging GG1 fleet in the early 1970s, but what rolled out of Erie, Pennsylvania was anything but elegant. The E60 was built between 1974 and 1976 to replace Amtrak's aging fleet of electrics, mostly Pennsylvania Railroad's GG1S. The locomotive weighed 387,000 pounds and measured 71 feet 3 inches long, giving it a hulking, brutish appearance that looked more suited for coal drags than passenger service. The boxy carbody with its flat, uninspired lines made it look like someone had taken a freight locomotive and slapped cabs on both ends as an afterthought, because that's essentially what happened. The EE60 was a double-ended design originally built for freight service on the Black Mesa and Lake Powell Railroad before being adapted for passenger use. The proportions were all wrong for a passenger locomotive, and the 6-axle trucks made it look squat and ungainly. Problems soon developed as the locomotives yawed sideways when accelerating. The Federal Railroad Administration restricted the maximum speed to 85 miles per hour after a derailment investigation revealed problems with the truck and bolster design. The EE60's aesthetic failures matched its technical ones, and Amtrak began replacing them with AEM-7 starting in 1980, with deliveries continuing into the mid-1980s. The EE60 proved that raw power doesn't equal good looks. 9. Baldwin Sharknose RF-16. Baldwin's RF-16, better known as the Sharknose, provokes strong reactions to this day. Built between 1950 and 1953, the RF-16 was a 1,600 horsepower cab unit diesel locomotive featuring Baldwin's distinctive Sharknose styling. The style was inspired by the Pennsylvania Railroad's T1 class duplex steam locomotive, and while some found its angular nose and aggressive lines appealing, others thought it looked like a locomotive that had collided with a wall at high speed. The sharply raked nose gave it a predatory appearance that some felt was trying too hard to look modern and ended up looking awkward instead. The styling featured a pointed snout with distinctive grillwork around the headlight, but the proportions often seemed off. The nose appeared too long for the body, giving it an unbalanced, top-heavy appearance. A total of 109 cab-equipped A units were built, along with 51 cabless booster B units, purchased mainly by Pennsylvania, Baltimore, and Ohio, and New York Central railroads. The RF-16 quickly gained a reputation as a reliable and rugged locomotive with tough lugging power, and it excelled in coal drag service where looks didn't matter. In 1966, the Pennsylvania Railroad ceased use of the distinctive locomotives, and most were scrapped soon after. Today, only 2 surviving Baldwin RF-16 Sharknose units remain, stored away from public view. Love it or hate it, the Sharknose's appearance was anything but forgettable. It was just a matter of whether you wanted to remember it. Before we move on to the next one in the list, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you're enjoying this content so far, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch these videos without subscribing. Imagine what we could accomplish if everyone subscribed. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. Thanks to all of you who do. 8. Fairbanks Morse Train Master H2466. The Fairbanks Morse. H2466, known as the Train Master, was produced between 1953 and 1958, and while it packed serious muscle, its appearance was decidedly ungainly. Each locomotive produced 2,400 horsepower using Fairbanks Morse's opposed piston prime mover, making it the highest horsepower road switcher on the market when introduced in 1953. The Trainmaster was a beast. Plain and simple, not only physically larger than all other diesel locomotives of the day, they were also built to haul. but that size came at an aesthetic cost. The tall profile of the opposed piston engine dictated an unusually high hood that made the locomotive look top-heavy and ungainly, like it might tip over on curves. The proportions were awkward, with the cab seeming too small for the massive long hood that stretched behind it. While the trainmaster measured 66 feet long, 10 feet 4.5 inches wide, and 15 feet high, those dimensions didn't translate into graceful lines. Instead, it looked bulky and industrial in the worst way. The high, short nose with its rounded point added to the ungainly appearance, and the overall design lacked the streamlining or visual balance that characterized more attractive locomotives of the era. Fairbanks Morse sold 127 trainmasters, 1953-1957. Despite strong performance, the tall hood and bulk limited sales compared with EMD's offerings. Only one trainmaster locomotive has survived intact, former Canadian Pacific Railway H2466, number 8905, preserved at the Canadian Railway Museum. While the trainmaster could certainly pull, it couldn't overcome its reputation for being an oil-guzzling, maintenance-intensive eyesore. 7. EMD DD35A. The EMD DD35A was a 5,000 horsepower diesel-electric locomotive built exclusively for Union Pacific Railroad in 1965, and it looked every bit as experimental as it was. 15. DD35. Locomotives were built between May and July 1965, assigned road numbers 70 through 84. The DD35A was essentially two GP35 locomotives stuck together on a single frame, riding on a pair of 4-axle flexicoil trucks. The result was an ungainly monster that looked like it couldn't decide if it wanted to be one locomotive or two. The proportions were all wrong, too long, too heavy, and with an awkward bulge in the middle where the radiators were located. The DD35A was fitted with the new flared radiator section EMD was testing on its demonstrators, which only added to its ungainly appearance. At 88 feet 2 in long, the DD35A weighed about 519,000 pounds. The earlier cabless DD35 about 522,000 pounds, making them absolute behemoths that dwarfed everything around them. The cab, perched at one end of this massive frame, looked comically small and out of proportion, like someone had grafted a GP35 cab onto a freight car. Union Pacific's quest for high-horsepower single units to replace gas turbines meant aesthetic appeal took a backseat to raw power. The DD35s were initially quite unreliable, with problems blamed on sand from internal sandboxes getting an electrical gear. They were withdrawn from service by 1981, and no examples were preserved. The DD35A proved that sometimes two heads aren't better than one, at least not when it comes to locomotive looks. 6. P30CH Pooch. The P30CH was built for Amtrak between 1975 and 1976, with 25 units ordered, and its nickname, Pooch, tells you everything you need to know about how crews felt about its looks. The model designation led to the unit's nickname, Pooch, and the name stuck for good reason. The P30CH was essentially a U30C freight locomotive with a cowl body and head-end power generator system, and that freight locomotive heritage showed through in all the wrong ways. The design featured a squared-off nose that looked brutish and ungainly, completely lacking the streamlined elegance that passenger locomotives were supposed to embody. The P30CH was a 6-axle, 3,000 horsepower locomotive powered by a GE7 FDL16 diesel engine, riding on C-C trucks that made it look heavy and sluggish. The proportions were awkward, with the full cowl body failing to hide the locomotive's freight origins. The 6-axle P30CHs cost Amtrak $480,000 each and were plagued with mechanical problems that matched their aesthetic shortcomings. One important detail was that the P30CHs were originally ordered to handle trains from New Haven to Boston, but were quickly found to be too heavy for some bridges and assigned elsewhere. The Pooch spent its career shuffling between various routes where its appearance and reliability issues were equally unwelcome. With new power arriving, Amtrak retired the P30CH fleet in June 1992. All were later scrapped. The P30CH proved that You can't just wrap a freight locomotive in passenger clothes and expect anyone to be fooled. 5. Alco Century 855. The Alco Century 855 was built in 1964 for Union Pacific, rated at 5,500 horsepower, making it the most powerful diesel locomotive ever built at the time. But all that power came wrapped in one of the most ungainly packages ever to ride the rails. The locomotive employed two of Alco's 251 C-prime movers that together could produce 5,500 horsepower, rode on 4 B-B trucks, and weighed a grueling 551,000 pounds. The result was a massive, hulking brute that looked like Alco had simply bolted two locomotives together and called it a day. The Century 855 stretched an incredible 88 feet long, and its proportions were all wrong, too heavy, and with an awkward distribution of mass that made it look unstable. The carbody design featured a bland, industrial appearance with no attempt at streamlining or visual appeal whatsoever. It was just a big metal box on wheels, painted yellow and gray, with none of the grace or elegance that characterized better-looking locomotives. Only 3 examples were built, and despite its impressive power output, all were scrapped by early 1972 due to mechanical unreliability. The CC 855s were plagued with reliability issues due to rush production. Problems included the use of aluminum wiring, which often caught fire, general overheating, and frames prone to cracking. Union Pacific's experiment with the CC 855 proved that raw power and ugly looks often go hand in hand, and that sometimes bigger definitely isn't better. The locomotive's appearance matched its reputation: heavy, problematic, and best forgotten. No examples survive today. All 3 units were scrapped, and that's probably for the best. 4. GE U50C. The GE U50C was a 5,000 horsepower diesel-electric locomotive built between November 1969 and November 1971, with 40 units built solely for Union Pacific, numbered 5,000 to 5,039. If the original U50 was ungainly, the U50C somehow managed to be even worse. The U50C used a pair of 3-axle trucks instead of the 4 2-axle trucks used on the earlier U50, powered by 2 2,500 horsepower diesel engines. The locomotive was 79 feet long, and every inch of that length looked awkward and ungainly. The worst part was the radiator section. The engines were reversed in orientation compared to the U50, so the radiator sections were at the middle of the locomotive instead of the ends, creating a massive bulge in the center that made the locomotive look bloated and swollen. This wide radiator section design gave the U50C an appearance that can only be described as pregnant, like it had swallowed another locomotive whole. The proportions were terrible, with the cab looking too small at one end and the radiators dominating the middle, creating a visual imbalance that was painful to behold. The U50C was not successful. Weight-saving measures caused problems, especially with the electrical wiring. Aluminum wires instead of copper proved prone to overheating, and the U50Cs had many electrical fires. The aluminum wire was subject to shorts and fires, not up to carrying the current needed to drive the traction motors, which was the major downfall of the units. Union Pacific's U50C fleet spent most of its short life either broken down or catching fire, and by the late 70s, all were awaiting the scrapper's torch. The U50C proved that sometimes evolution goes in the wrong direction. 3. GE U50. The GE U50 was an 8-axle, 5,000 horsepower diesel-electric locomotive built by GE Transportation in 1963. And it looked exactly like what it was an experiment that went horribly wrong. The U50 was built in response to Union Pacific's requirement for a 15,000 horsepower, 3-unit locomotive intended to replace turbines. GE came up with what was essentially 2 U25B locomotives on a single frame, the U50. Initial deliveries were 3 to Union Pacific, October 1963, and 3 to Southern Pacific, May-June 1964. UP ultimately rostered 23 U50s in total. The U50 rode on 4 2-axle trucks grouped in pairs linked by span bolsters, giving a wheel arrangement of B plus B-B plus B. The result was a locomotive that looked like a centipede with its nearly continuous line of wheels from front to back. At 83 feet 6 inches long and 279 tons, the U-50 was a hulking giant that dominated everything around it. The proportions were completely wrong, with the cab perched awkwardly at one end of a massive frame that seemed to go on forever. The long hood stretched endlessly behind the cab, broken only by radiator sections that did nothing to improve the locomotive's appearance. While Union Pacific nicknamed their units U-boats, Southern Pacific's units gained the nickname Baby Hueys, from the cartoon character, a reference to the oversized, awkward, and somewhat dim-witted baby duck. The nickname was apt, as the U-50 looked like it had grown too big, too fast, and couldn't quite figure out how to move all those wheels in coordination. The last 3 Union Pacific units remained on the roster until April 1977, when they were finally retired. The U-50 proved that 8 axles are 7 too many when it comes to good looks. 2. GM Aerotrain. General Motors built 2 Aerotrains in 1955, each consisting of an EMD LWT 12 locomotive and 10 modified GMC bus bodies as passenger cars. If you've ever wondered what would happen if someone tried to make a train out of buses, the Aerotrain is your answer, and it's not a pretty sight. The Aerotrain's locomotive was based on EMD's SWO 1200 switcher engine, designed for 100-plus miles per hour conceptually, but geared for approximately 83 miles per hour in practice, with a 567 CV12 diesel engine rated at 1,200 horsepower. The locomotive itself wasn't particularly attractive, with a cab designed to look like an aircraft cockpit and a front end featuring headlights and a grille like a car, as well as a wraparound windshield. But the real horror show was behind the locomotive. The passenger cars were based on GM's bus designs, 40-foot-long aluminum bodies riding on 2 axle carriages with air suspension. The finned rear observation car resembled the rear of a 1955 Chevrolet or Pontiac station wagon. The Aerotrain looked like a carnival ride more than serious transportation, and passengers quickly discovered it rode like one too. Their cars were rough riding and uncomfortable. The air suspension system was intended to give a smooth ride, but had the opposite effect. The 1,200 horsepower engine was insufficient, requiring a helper locomotive to climb grades. The 2-axle bus-bodied passenger coaches were noisy and uncomfortable. All of the roads rejected the Aerotrain. In October 1958, General Motors sold both train sets at a discount to the Rock Island Line, which used them in commuter service until retiring them in 1966. Today, the 2 trains are in museums at the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, where they serve as cautionary tales about what happens when you try to reinvent the wheel, or in this case, put bus bodies on train tracks. 1. Baldwin Centipede DR 12-8-1502. Taking the top spot on our list is the Baldwin Centipede, a locomotive so bizarre and ungainly that it looks like someone assembled it from spare parts while drunk. The Baldwin DR 12-8-1502, known as the Centipede, was built between December 1945 and July 1948. Seaboard Airline is credited with the initial idea for what became the Centipede, wanting a locomotive with smooth riding characteristics that could produce 6,000 horsepower via 2 units instead of the conventional 3. What they got was a nightmare on wheels. The designation stood for diesel road, 12 axles, 8 of which were connected to traction motors, with 2 engines each, producing 1,500 horsepower. The trucks were configured in a 2-D plus D-2 wheel arrangement. The nickname came from the numerous axles set in a nearly unbroken line, much like the legs of a centipede. Stretching over 90 feet in length and weighing nearly 297 tons, the Centipede looked like someone had stretched a normal locomotive on a medieval rack and forgotten to stop. The car body rode on 2 massive articulated cast steel half frames cast by General Steel Castings, linked at the middle with a hinged joint. The baby-faced design reflected Baldwin's steam and electric locomotive practice, with a rounded, bulbous nose that looked utterly ridiculous on such a massive locomotive. The endless parade of wheels beneath the car body created a visual that was both hypnotic and horrifying. It just went on and on and on. 12 axles of pure awkwardness. Reliability was an ongoing problem, and as they were built one at a time like steam locomotives, each one was a bit different in the placement of wiring and equipment, which complicated even routine maintenance. Despite their impressive sight working a train, all three examples for each railroad were scrapped by the early 1960s. No centipedes have been preserved, which is probably for the best. The centipede stands as the ultimate example of function without form, a locomotive so singularly ugly that it earns our top spot without question. These 10 locomotives remind us that not every railroad experiment was destined to become a classic, and that sometimes raw power and innovative engineering come wrapped in packages that only their builders could love. From the endless wheels of the Baldwin Centipede to the bus-bodied nightmare of the GM Aerotrain, these machines push the boundaries of diesel locomotive design. Unfortunately, they also push the boundaries of what could be considered aesthetically acceptable. While most of these ungainly beasts have been scrapped and forgotten, they played important roles in railroad history, teaching engineers valuable lessons about what not to do. They served faithfully despite their awkward appearances, proving that you don't have to be beautiful to get the job done. These locomotives may not have been easy on the eyes, but they hauled freight, pulled passengers, and kept America's railroads running through some of their most challenging years. Hope you found this video helpful in understanding the more unusual side of American railroad history. If you enjoyed this journey through the ugly side of locomotive design, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into railroad history. We've got plenty more fascinating stories from the rails coming your way, from the beautiful to the bizarre. Drop a comment below and let us know which of these locomotives you think deserves the ugliest crown, or if there's another awkward machine you think should have made the list. Until next time, keep those wheels turning.